Okay, so why don't we get started? Welcome everyone to our fourth and last book sandwiched in of the fall season. Today we have Margaret Kasper Reed and Skip Reed, and they'll be reviewing the book, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside the Brain by Annie Murphy Paul. Margaret Kasper Reed is an educator and a writer, and Skip Reed is a woodworker and a pastor. Now they have prepared a pre-recorded presentation. So we'll watch that first, and please hold your questions until the end, and then type them in as usual in chat. And during the review, please mute yourself and stay muted so that we can avoid any of the background noises. And we're about ready to get started. So without further delay.
Away we go.
So here we are, virtually talking about the book, The Extended Mind, The Power of Thinking Outside of the Brain by Annie Murphy Paul, which I know that you found first, but I finished first. Not that there's any competition with a joint book review, right?
I hope so. In any case, you are absolutely right. I read it on Kindle. I listened to portions of it on Audible. And at the same time, you were marking up the printed book and got done ahead of me, writing your squiggly notes to yourself in the book.
So how do you do a joint book review anyways? Well, how do two people do anything together with alacrity and grace, right?
Right.
Like much these days, we find that we are winging it on Zoom, imagining you our amorphous audience, perhaps. We have found that just about everything we've encountered in the last couple of months, though, we have been able to relate to the ideas in this book. So that's pretty cool, right?
That is pretty cool. We were hoping that this could make our 7 decades old brains into things that could work with greater precision, greater speed, and greater acuity. What do you think?
Good luck. Yeah, I think we need a lower bar.
Okay.
Something like, remembering phone numbers or a grocery list with more than 6 items, retrieving the name of that author, the one that we both read, the cover was book, the blue and that kind of thing. I know that you read that you should never begin a talk with a joke because when you do that, your audience is going to think that you're a lightweight.
Right.
So take it away.
But humor also lets the world flip upside down, and we have a concept for how we think that sort of flips things upside down. So here's a story from my cherished friends Abe and Loda. And so one day they were home together, and Loda decided she needed something from downstairs. So she walked downstairs, and when she got to the bottom of those stairs, these two aged and self-humorous friends of mine addressed one another. And from the bottom of the stairs, Loda called up, "Hey Abe, what did I come down here for?" And in the interim, Abe had forgotten who she was and said, "Who are you?"
All right, so we read the book because we want to know who we are and what we're there for, right?
Exactly. So what we're after is metaphors for human thinking. That's what we're looking to come to terms with. Selfie snapshots of our understanding of how our minds work. These metaphors develop and change over time. In her book, The Extended Mind, how we think out, the power of thinking outside the brain, Annie Murphy Paul addresses a question that is perhaps the question of questions, intriguing us for centuries, if not millennia. Precisely what is human intelligence? How shall we picture human thought? How does it happen? Where does it happen? Paul offers us the strange metaphor for how our minds work of the magpie. That's right, the bird, as an apt descriptor of how human intelligence unfolds within the world within which it's situated. More to follow on that aviary front. But first, who is this author anyway?
Well, Annie Murphy Paul is a biology and a social science writer, and she was a graduate from Yale and the Columbia School of Journalism. And a number of her articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Scientific American, and the Best American Science Writing. And she really writes very fluidly. It's not overly poetic, but it is science writing made for a lay person.
It is.
And she's the author of 2 previous books, The Cult of Personality Testing, How Personality and is leading us to personality tests are leading us to miseducate our children, mismanage our companies, and misunderstand ourselves. And a second book that she has written is called Origins.
So when we took those personality tests back a few years, and we told Shannon and Dave that we were both NFIPs, and they said, "Uh-oh, you're in trouble." Does that mean that that doesn't apply anymore?
I think we better read the book to see what it means. It might not mean as much as they thought it meant, was that we were mismatched in life. Anyway, interestingly enough, in the book Origins that she wrote, the subtitle of that book was Origins, How the 9 Months Before Birth Shaped the Rest of Our Lives. And interestingly enough, in the middle of writing that book, she became pregnant and was able to test out some of the hypotheses that she had on her son. And one of the tidbits here, babies whose mother watched the soap opera The Guiding Light during their gestation get very excited when the theme song is played to them many, many months later. So that's pretty cool.
So back to our question. What is human thought? Where does it happen? How does it happen? Rodin's great sculpture gives us to think that it happens with intensity as we sit and ponder. Paul, however, addresses each of these questions in her extensive, comprehensive journaling of the research being done in the realm of human intelligence in the modern age. Early on, and with wry self-humor, our author catches a glimpse of herself in the 130 years old writings of Frederick Nietzsche. That is to say, as she was hunched over her early work on the extended mind, Paul read some of Nietzsche and was struck by his disdain for thinking that happens within, quote, a pinched belly, head bowed low over the paper, and she exclaims, "I'm caught."
Paul goes on to quote Nietzsche, thinking about thinking. He reminds us, she writes, that we should sit as little as possible, do not believe any idea that was not born in the open air and with free movement. And with that insight and encouragement, the extended mind was christened and set sail.
I'm an avid reader of science books, and I want to testify that I think this book is a tour de force of good research, acknowledged in good fashion and accumulated in such a fashion that it parades human intelligence and its evolution across time in ways that are deeply insightful. For example,
all right, she categorizes at the very beginning recent and still popular images of the human brain being more like a computer, for example, or if that metaphor doesn't work, subsequently being like a muscle.
Paul gives us rich narratives that outline the evolution of each of these metaphors, the first one emerging, the computer, in the 1940s in the wake of World War II. Paul finds her way forward from these still popular images to an image for thinking that startles and challenges at the same time. But first, a little more about the prior metaphors for human thought.
Many tomes have been written about human cognition, and many theories proposed and studies conducted, Tversky and Kahneman's among them. These efforts have produced countless illuminating insights, but they are limited by their assumption that thinking happens only inside the brain.
And so much less attention has been paid across the decades to the ways people use the world to think. The gestures of the hands, the space of a sketchbook, the act of listening to a story or telling a story, the task of teaching someone else. These extraneural inputs change the way we think. It could even be said that they constitute a part of our thinking process itself.
Our culture insists that the brain is the sole locus of thinking, a cordoned off space where cognition happens, much as the workings of my laptop are sealed off in its aluminum case. But this book argues otherwise.
It does, and it argues strenuously that the extended mind is something that can be pictured like the nest-building bird called the magpie. And on a walk, Annie spied one of these birds, and in researching it, she realized, as we look at the nests right there, that they build their nests in a very interesting way, strewing everything that they can find, all sorts of different things, to make their nest out of its available parts.
So how do our brains work like magpies? Magpies forage. They take from everywhere and every place everything they can find, little bits of aluminum and jewelry and pieces of rubber and scraps of paper. We do the same thing. We take it from everywhere. Paul explores this by using the research of cognitive scientists to examine how thought is shaped in three distinct areas. And the book is really divided into thirds with these three areas. So there are overarching umbrellas, so to speak. The first, she takes a look at bodily experience, then at our physical environments, both natural and man-made, and finally at social exchange and how that affects our thoughts too.
And so the core premise, to underscore it, of this book is this. Human intelligence consists of part one, neural inputs coming from within inside the brain, and then the radical proposition two, it consists in extraneural, which is to say outside the brain resources. So another way of saying this is that human intelligence is an odd admixture of elements within and outside the human skull that in their total interaction comprise human intelligence.
And interestingly, some of the resources outside of the human skull are nevertheless inside the human body. These bodily experiences include these kinds of things Skip will talk about.
So thinking with sensations. Interoception is the interesting term used for internal sensations that some people are gifted from the get-go to be able to read, and the rest of us are catching up with that. But we all have them to some measure. These are sensations that intelligently engage the problems before us, before and outside the realm of our brain-bound activity, our consciousness. Think gut feeling as an example. Ms. Paul notes that our bodies are often way ahead of our actual consciousness in anticipating what's going to happen next. And she cites the example of financial traders who are the most successful are often the ones whose ability to read internal sensations is the most refined. The determining factor in the financial sector, then, for these traders has less to do with their overwhelming formal education and much more to do with how they read, how their bodies, rather, engage with signals that are outside the neural inputs of their brains, but yet anticipating in unique and interesting ways what's about to happen.
And connected with this whole bodily sensation is how we think better with movement. In this image of Aristotle strolling, supposedly he would engage his students while walking, and he could think better, they could think better in terms of understanding him. Radiologist, she quoted some research where different radiologists were trying to improve their accuracy of reading x-rays, and they had some of them on a treadmill and some of them just seated at their desk looking at the x-rays. And while they were on the treadmill, they were able to increase their accuracy rate about 30%. So we do better when we're moving. And of course, as a teacher for eons, it's always been put those little buggers in their chair and just have them sit there and don't move, much like the Rodin statue.
So I have to say that the key element here is movement. and it's movement that evolutionarily we were gifted with. As we move, we navigate. Our brains are great, author Paul notes, at locating us in space. So spatial recognition, where we've been, recognizing familiar things, our brains are really well suited to do that, and they needed to be. When we're moving, not only do we have great focus on what we can see directly in front of us, but we have that peripheral vision with which we're gifted, which is constantly scanning in a less than fully conscious way what's on either side of us. And so those who were gifted in that way, they can sense something outside their vision but within the overall scheme of things, and that comes to us through our evolution. Time and again, Paul also brings home that in the current age we are now overwhelmed. How much information has been generated? The 90% of the information in the world has been generated within the last 3 or 4 years. So our brains are not outfitted, our biological brains, for dealing with this. And so along with Rebecca Solnit, author Paul stresses that modern life moves faster and faster than the speed of thought. And the brain-bound thinking that we do is not going to suffice to meet the challenges that we meet in the magnitude of information and complexity that we're facing all the time.
And with this whole movement idea too, when she talks about gestures, the motions of our hands and bodies, she doesn't think of gestures just as an addendum to our thoughts, that we say something and then we add these. And of course, she says we should be doing gestures while we're doing all of this. But miming, for example, if you look at gestures, she says they're fundamental to our offloading some of our thinking into our body's movements. And she uses this offloading frequently and talks about how much mental bandwidth we have, and that the more that we can get that out of here into our hands, the better we are. Gestures, which include everything, hands, face, arms, legs, torso, are really the way that our thinking happens outside of our head, and it circles back into our brains. And sometimes we know things there first.
Yeah. And so there was an interesting study for the physics students that she noted with very complex physics problems. There was an experiment done with the students using gestures before they were consciously understanding what was at play, to use their hand gestures to try to gesture what the problem was, and therefore or thereby come upon the solution. And from all of that, what can be deduced is that the gestures of our hands are an aspect of our thinking, and that they often are out ahead of our thinking, and they help us think through, quite literally, what otherwise our consciousness can't follow, and enables us to go forward in unique ways.
All right. So if we go forward to our ancestors here, let's call look at, he's lined up with you. There's Crow.
Are you
Crow.
saying I look like him?
They're the ancestors. Very handsome you are. All right, Crow. Let's call them Crow and Megs. But she looks at our origins, and she talks about our ancestors, and our brain was really made for those people and in those times, and how our brain is really not made for who we are now in the world that we live in now. And so she said that they evolved to thrive outdoors, and today only about 7% of our time is spent outdoors. Nonetheless, our aesthetic preferences have been honed over these millennia. And so what are we built for? Well,
we are built for looking at long distances in many directions from a protected perch, having curved lines and color saturation. I remember her writing about the design of Central Park and how that it really is a lot more like a Serengeti plain in Africa. And the landscape designer, the landscape architect, was very intentional to create that protected perch from which you can see things at a distance from a knoll, and then look at those trees that arch out in the distance. Natural scenes have more redundant lines and fractals, and we prefer our fractals mid-range, the research shows. Ms. Paul also speaks of our soft fascination with nature and uses scientific studies to back up her ideas. For example, after an extended foray into the world, backpackers are 50% more creative at coming up with multiple solutions to complex questions.
So we're finishing up these fractals and how these designs, when we have them replicated in man-made spaces, they just psychically connect with us. This room I had found, and the architect brought the outside in. And can't you just imagine how much more fertile your thinking would be in a green space like that? Or there is that whole branch of architecture where we take those fractals or these forms from nature and we replicate them in the design. So here we've got a mushroom design that's replicated in a light fixture or these kinds of things. So pretty cool. She also addresses neuroarchitecture and examines how the brain responds to buildings and their interiors. Turns out we think loftier thoughts under vaulted spaces. The image here is from the Cathedral of Learning that's part of the Carnegie School in Pittsburgh. And I've been here with my granddaughter before, and she sat in a big chair in this space. And it's a student union of sorts. And I just thought, oh, what a magnificent place for kids to be thinking. And you almost could just kind of see those thoughts going up in bubbles and, mingling together and fermenting. But what a place to think. And we do think differently in these places. I like that.
So Annie Murphy Paul does not confine herself to the modern age, and she returns to the medieval times and references these people that we see here, the privates. So this is Frederica de Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, and these two, seen as husband and wife, are a serious couple indeed, don't you think?
Yes, her name is Gentile. And she does look very genteel.
And so Frederico was among the first to have a study built that reflected on the outside and on the inside what was going on with the human mind.
So I'm going to go back just a minute to this, maybe not.
Well, we should be able to.
No, that's okay. So she goes then from how in his study he had all of these icons and artifacts around his study that reminded him of who he was.
Mm-hmm.
And then she looks at our modern office spaces, which have ended up looking like this in this depiction. And she notes that the cues of our identity and affiliation are important in our workspaces, and that our physiology is not meant to overhear bits of other people's conversations, that even a snippet of a conversation will pull our attention away. And so, when I'm checking out at the eye doctor's or something, and the receptionist has all of her pictures of her kids and her family and all of this on the wall, that I think Annie Murphy Paul would say that's what you want. It's a good idea. It's reminding you of who you are, and we need spaces that do that and not spaces that erase from that.
That's a perfect segue into this last section of the book, right? Where at the last third of the book takes a look at thinking with relationships. And
I think we wanted to show this too.
Right.
All right, so before we go to the relationships, we both had sections where there were just tidbits that showed up. Someone's calling, we're going to ignore that. There were tidbits of things that we are the only creature to have whites of our eyes. And she said that This is why in an office space like that too, if you can see other people's eyes or that they're upon you, you don't quite think as well at that point. So
we are
keep
those,
going.
and certainly during COVID time, right, where we're masked, so the only thing we can see is our eyes.
Right.
The eyes are very revelatory, and you can see as people look, they're expressing a great deal. When we went out with your mom to dinner there the other day, and Sarah, or Anna, her name was, she had very lively eyes. They would shoot from person to person at the table, and you could get a sense of how much she was taking in because we could see those eyes moving because of the whites. So yes. All right, so it turns out that we think better, or we think best when we think socially, Annie Murphy Paul says.
Like we've been doing, right?
Right, like we've been doing.
Okay. Paul challenges this myth that all serious thinking is done alone.
And knowledge is more abundant today. Expertise is specialized and problems are much more complex.
And more than ever, we need to use the minds of other people's. I'm using your mind, okay? You're
And
using my mind,
yep.
such as they are. And we think through each other.
We do. So among using minds, there's losing minds, and occasionally I'm in search of my mind. And
Right.
But it is all a lot like osmosis, I think. And
Yes.
so here we have
All right, Paul suggests that we need to shift more from the individual to the group. We see this shift with best practices in education for sure, and she's written a lot in these science journals about education. Groupthink, cooperative learning, jigsaw learning have all worked their way into classrooms.
Science has certainly followed suit. Our author notes that fewer than 10% of scientific studies are written by one person in the modern era. As Andy Clark has pointed out, the philosopher on whose work Annie Murphy Paul has grounded a great deal of this theory of the magpie as the brain, as Andy Clark has pointed out, when computer scientists develop artificial intelligence systems, they don't design machines that compute for a while, print out their results, distribute the results amongst their friends, have a look-see, inspect what they produced, and then add some marks in the margin, some of your squiggly notes in the margin, and then circulate the copies among colleagues, and new steps are taken. That's not how computers work. It's exactly how we humans work. We are, and I quote as Clark in saying this, intrinsically loopy creatures.
You got it. Loopy. I do like that. All right, it seems pretty free-form, winding, and full of potential somehow. You can always kind of wind back, you know. It's a process that just continues as putting together a PowerPoint or a talk is.
Mm-hmm.
So something about our biological intelligence benefits from being rotated in and out of internal and external modes of cognition, from being passed among the brain and the body and the world. This means that we should resist the urge to shunt our thinking along that linear path appropriate to a computer. It's not all about input, output, done, and instead allow some time for yourself to be loopy, honey.
Loopy.
All right, loopy.
Now, speaking of loopy, don't you think it's about time we wrapped up this report, my dear?
Yes.
And so, maybe we have time to plan a trip. Would you like to go to Italy?
Oh, I'd love to go to Italy. Oh, yes. Now, do you remember what Gracie Allen said? So she began her little spiel there. Oh, Italy, we'll have a wonderful time listening to the beautiful music while we're riding on one of those gorgonzolas on the canals of Venice.
Gorgonzola is a cheese.
Well, what do we care, as long as it doesn't leak?
Is our ship sinking here, my dear? Time to wind up this travelogue through this book.
Absolutely. So what do we say about the book? 5 stars, thumbs up,
Yep.
First rating?
For sure.
So how about we end with Paul's suggestions about using all of this information? And this is how she does end.
Listen to your body.
Surround your space with green spaces and long views if you can.
Offload information every opportunity you have.
Create artifacts.
Alter and enhance your mental state with movement.
Wow. She's amazing. I don't think we could do that.
Yeah, I know I couldn't do that. How about that? More our speed these days?
There we go. That you can do. And actually, she does talk about how the Japanese group exercise, where everybody does it at 8 o'clock in the morning, is that synchronicity is really psychically good for you and good for your brain, because we like all being on the same page. Okay.
We do. And so, socialize, talk to others, friends and colleagues, and hopefully do this in real time the next time.
Our thanks to Annie. All right. We feel that we can call her by her first name at this point. We had this big discussion, is in a book review, should she be Ms. Paul or just Paul? The New York Times did use just the last name, I'm saying, but she's Annie to us now. She does have a great TED Talk that and interviews online with educational forums if you'd like to check her out a little bit more.
Her humility and what she teaches is so good. We can't recommend this book highly enough to you. We pray and hope it's your enjoyment, and it certainly has been ours. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much for the book review. It was fascinating. You gave us lots and lots to think about. So if you have questions, please type them into chat and I'll read them as they come up.
That's all right. You'll remember.
I have a question. How did you first hear of this book or learn of this book or learn of Annie Murphy Paul?
I suspect it was actually through Audible, which would have said, you've been interested in these things before, and so here's one you might be interested in. Or it could have been, but it came across my screen, and then as soon as I started to read it, I was captured by it.
Thank you. Okay, for our first comment on chat is not a question. Great graphics and great dual presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, actually, I'd like to take exception with the picture of me supposedly being that Cro-Magnon guy, and Margaret.
She looked better.
She looked a lot better
than
I didn't think
than the
that was
males.
any compliment to me. I'm just saying, it wasn't lost on me.
Yeah.
And next is it okay to use raise hand icon and ask question verbally? I don't know about raised hand icon.
It's just a little thing that pops up if someone wanted to ask a question. You can see it if you look on people's pictures at the top.
Okay, so I don't know if that person is, I don't know whether that person's picture's at the top.
Yep. Yeah, I think it's okay if you want to ask your question verbally, if you don't want to type. We just said type it in because we didn't want people trying to talk at the same time.
Okay, so what do I do?
You don't have to do anything. If she wants to unmute herself, she can just ask the question right now.
Okay. Did she hear you?
Yeah, yes, I heard her. I didn't, because it's such a small group and it's such a great complicated topic. I thought that maybe some of the questions would be so involved, it would be hard to type them, and this might be a little easier. But if you raise your hand, I'm just learning all this stuff, but if you raise your hand, then you don't talk over one another. And I know for sure I am a talker over, having grown up in Queens. That's like my normal part of conversation. So just one comment and one kind of question. I don't know who said it. It was told to me that it was said by St. Augustine, but then somebody told me that's absolutely wrong. But it's a great phrase. And for those of you who speak Italian and I don't, please forgive me. but the translation is, it is solved by walking. It is solved by walking. And I love that. I mean, and I don't know how it was originally used, but it's like salvatur ambulando or something like that for you Italian speakers. The other thing was when she was talking about group learning and groupthink and cooperative learning in schools. And then, Margaret, you had also talked about the fact that even snippets of conversation or seeing the whites of someone's eyes, because we're so intrinsically social, is enough to be a distraction. Those two things are somewhat contradictory, or can be. So this whole idea of open office space, which was all the rage, right, in tech, it turned out not to be so good. So there's a time and a place for everything. And the idea of having a time when you can loop and bounce off your ideas and all that is fine. But the idea that that has to always be part of your day, and you never have an office or a place that you can quietly close the door and just think in isolation, is not, I don't, my experience is that is not good. And I think that in business, they're beginning to realize that as well.
She talked quite a bit about the design for research spaces for MIT that were on the coast of California that included all of that neuroarchitecture with the vaulted spaces and the view of the sea, and a long corridor that mirrored a monastery. And she talks at length about how the monastic program of having so much solitary time and so much communal time is exactly what you're saying, Ellen, that's the ticket, and that, you know, too much of either one. We need that social connectivity, but we also need those walls and our own spaces to do our thinking too. And yeah, both.
And actually, to build off of that metaphor, then, yeah, when she's talking about teams that work well together, it's not that they talk a lot, but do you remember they actually
Yes.
organize in such a fashion that it's known that Margaret's really good at imagery and Skip's not good at much. And so we're going to make sure that Margaret does the imagery in the group, and the group goes around and actually individuates a bit so that different people with their different strengths are making different contributions. But the point she does make about language and our hearing it is that if we're trying to concentrate on something and somebody's talking in the next room, our very neurology will not permit us to not overhear that. So we
and the same with music.
Yeah.
You know, you've read all of this and how music, the Mozart effect, can enhance your comprehension. And she said, only if it is, you know, very, very dull and waltz-like, and because anything else that has complex rhythms or anything that has words with it will pull our attention rather than fostering it at the same time.
Good comment and question.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Kate. This is Mary. Hi, guys. Wonderful job. As I'm listening, I'm also thinking about about the fact that the brain, in its complexity, is also something we've learned as a very primitive part, and it's always evolving. So the idea that one thing or another is the way it works is confining, and it also can get, for instance, in my opinion, that the idea that having and controlling is a very strong part of the human creature because of evolutionary conditions. And so there's the security that comes from knowing in a particular way. This is opening up a whole space, but when you look, for instance, at people who are think very rigidly, and even if we're looking back at, you know, wonderful Renaissance period, this is also marked by people who are very interested in having money and things and controlling parts of society. So this way of thinking about thinking is more open, and it seems to me interesting that this is a woman speaking now about the way thinking operates. I mean, for those of us who are writers, I think we're very aware often of how movement makes a difference in the way we can open up to different ideas and being out in nature. But I was also struck back to this idea of the way we operate now, that rather than encouraging people to take care of the planet and be outside more attention, the idea of creating architecture now that makes money for people and has a redesign idea where you bring it inside. That not everybody, you know, most of us will be able to have a plant in our house, for instance, where this absolutely gorgeous draped plants hanging down is not something most of us are going to be able to accomplish. So it's a beautiful design, but it's also meant to sell something, sell a particular idea and a way of being that marks people as different from others. So we're way complex, and I'm all about what she has to say about the way we think. And just one more thing, I'm thinking about the fact that I'm Northern European, so using hands has come very late in my life, married to an Italian. And so I'm more aware of that and have Italians in my family. But I come from a very stoic culture where we look at people and we watch them, but we don't participate in so much hand gesture. In fact, it's often seen as distracting and rude to do that kind of thing. So cultural differences altogether too. I'm looking at the fact that now that people are more in communication, we can also benefit from this very kind of thing. I'm wondering how long it will take for an educational system or a system to figure out how they can make money on this idea before it becomes something people can actually get used to and accept.
Well, actually, she cites a study of an educational system out in California, Kay, that does use this and used various parts of it, including having the kids who were otherwise very separated and having to sit still, work together as teams. And as they work together as teams, associate with one another and distribute different parts of the function together, of their togetherness, and then think together, not thinking the same thing, but sharing.
Well, and starting, I forget the name of the school district in California, but they start their day with a 2-mile walk, and whatever topic is being discussed, they start this with this. And she connects this to some of the changes with at least stand-up desks that are not just available in office spaces, but that educationally we're working with these things too. So I think she's looking for ways in which this can be incorporated. And again, everyone's not going to be able to have the architecture to have what we saw with that green space, but when city planning is done or when new constructions are made, you can take these things into account, hopefully, and make things a little bit better for everybody.
Yeah,
hopefully.
We have another question. Does the author write about smell, which brings so many memories and feelings?
actually, there was just a small portion where scent was included, but not a great deal. No, there, as Margaret said, I mean, it would be under that bodily sensation or the interoception that that's 1/3 of the book. And I want to pay tribute to the way the book is written. It's very fluid, as Margaret said. Its prose is clear. It's that she's referencing other people's work. She notes, and you can find different interviews with her online. She's very charming. She's very disarming. She's humble. She's quick to point out she would make a terrible scientist because she's not patient enough. But what she is a very good writer and parades, so in the way of sensations, how the reading of these sensations, especially, I thought it was a fascinating thing about the financial traders. I had read that somewhere else, I guess, that their bodies themselves are ahead of what their conscious thinking is. And they're connecting with things that are in the air, that are on the screen, patterns that are helping. Really fascinating. And she's not talking metaphysics here. It's not woo, it's really our body's full engagement of the world, our brain almost notwithstanding.
Mm-hmm.
Another question is, I am curious about auditory versus visual learning. For example, audiobooks versus physical books.
Well, we have that split right here in the house because I love to listen to things and read them on my Kindle, and Margaret is death on that. She figures reading a book and making your notes is the way to go, which are both ways of processing. But I don't think I remember her getting into that much.
No, when she talks about the interoception, that it's just listening to these different modalities, but she doesn't talk about that. What she does talk about is things where luminosity and a lot of these programs that are geared towards senior Americans promise more than they can give. And that there was some, huge, like $2 billion lawsuit over luminosity for false advertising in terms of what they could promise. And so I think rather than signing up for programs like that, she's asking you to do some of these strategies that she talks about to improve how you think. So
I want to say a core theme of hers is that in the modern age, our brain-bound thinking is overwhelmed, that we are not going to think our way through the complexities, as it were, with our brains. And it will take the kind of activity and dynamic described by the magpie of strewing rich resources all around ourselves, thinking through those, which is to say, observe and then absorb what's going on around us and coming back. This looping, this looping phenomenon that she describes very well with that business of what a computer is and what it is not. And the computer isn't the thing that takes notes, gets together with other computers, shoots the shit about, or talks a little bit about it. And then it's not what a computer does, but it is what humans do. And she reminds me of other science writers in being hopeful about the human making it through this next stretch, but noting that we're up against things that individual brains aren't going to solve.
Another comment is brilliant presentation information. Can you get the book anywhere but Amazon?
I'm sure you can. The book is published by a major publisher, and so it's got to be out there and around. It's published by who's it published by? Margaret. Margaret's going to tell you who it's published by. So it's got to be available out and around, I'm sure. And it's a nice compliment. Let me just say, appreciate that. Margaret did 90% of this. She got those.
Houghton Mifflin.
It's
Houghton Mifflin.
Houghton Mifflin Publishers. Margaret is the one that found those images, and if it would have been up to Margaret, we would have had music, we would have had movies, we would have had acting, we would have had everything. So we got to rein that girl in.
It's that magpie thing.
It's the magpie thing. So, but Margaret gets the credit for almost all of what you saw, except for picking Cro-Magnon man, me for.
That's okay.
I should have edited that out of there.
Yeah, it's okay.
There's a request that you hold up the book.
Oh, okay. So it's about, actually, the last,
Hold it up.
how many pages are just notes? This much of the end of the book are just her notes from this. So.
And if
About
somebody wants to
300-400 pages.
borrow our copy, they may.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. Are there any other comments or questions that people have?
Thank you very much for listening and such a nice day.
We didn't expect.
Go outside in the sunshine.
We're seeing many old friends out there. It was
Yeah.
very kind of you. We're humbled that you chose to do this. Thanks.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. This sounds like a fascinating book.
Okay.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
your very
Barb. Okay. Thanks
Thank
to the
you.
library. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.